I'm saying. Right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming, and also welcome to our Zoom listeners. I imagine everybody knows how to find the Southern Cross at night. Yes, it's there, isn't it? If anyone says, what is the best thing to find in the sky, you go up and find the Southern Cross. And we tend to often take it for granted, and it would be interesting just to get some background on this on the system, which is, and a bit of its history. It might have been around for a long time, but we didn't know that. So that's what the today, and also looking at how it's influences culture and mythology, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, etc., and also a bit of information about the main stars as well. So the Southern Cross of Crooks, which is the name of the constellation that it's part of, often used interchangeably. And in fact, when I was reading on this, people kept talking about crooks in the 15th century. It didn't exist in the 15th century as a constellation. So there's a lot of interchange. We often use the term Southern Cross. And in fact, this diagram shows this. It's not crooks, but all we have is Southern Cross. There are one or two other stars in crooks. And it's unusual because it's a constellation that's totally dominated by its tourism. It's not the only one, but the best example. The Southern Cross is circumpolar, i.e. visible all year round. From 34 degrees south.
Okay.
So it's looking at where the Southern Cross is circumpolar, i.e. visible all year round, from a 34 degrees south. So Worcester may have a problem. We only just catch it in Southern Africa. But it's also obviously visible, seen where you can see the black line on there. Very southern parts of Australia, includes whole of New Zealand and bits of South America. So we have the luxury of being able to see the Southern Cross all year round from where we are, but further north. And I understand even in Johannesburg, there are times of year when you can't see all of it. So the further north you are, the less, and then it won't be circumpolar. And if you want to see it at its best, late May, freezing cold. Now that's its circumpolar position, but its full visibility as an asterism actually is visible up to 25 degrees north. So it's way up into the northern hemisphere. I couldn't find a picture, an image with 25 degrees north, but this is 23 degrees north. So just mentally move up a couple of degrees. So people at certain times of year in Hawaii, Mexico, just the southern part of mainland America, across North Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, China, and a tiny bit of Taiwan. If you're up there at certain times of year and you're preferably standing quite high, you may see it right on the horizon. So it's fully visible up to that point. Further north than that, you're losing it. It's partially visible, parts of it, up to 34 degrees north, which is the other end of Africa from where we are. We're on 34. So again, some of it, parts of it are visible a little bit further north, but that's as far north as anyone can see the Southern Cross at the moment. But that wasn't always the case, because a few thousand years ago, the Greeks could see it. And in fact, it was visible, parts of it were visible in Great Britain. So about 3,000 years BC, and again, I've used crooks, or Southern Cross interchangeably, because crooks didn't exist then, was fully visible right as far north as the British Isles. But over time, as time passed, by about 1000 BCE, it was only visible in Athens. So the visibility was moving south and very low in the sky. And then at 150 BCE, the famous Greek astronomer Hipparchus, who also did lots of observations, and he compared his observations with data that had been recorded by the Babylonians several thousand years beforehand. And he noticed that there were differences. and that his readings and his recordings were consistently different from those of the predecessors. And this suggested that the Earth was moving, not the stars, which was revolutionary at the time because in those days the Earth was static. That was the belief. But what he'd done was actually discover what's the third known motion of the Earth. So we knew about daily rotation, we knew about annual revolution around the sun. What he'd identified is this notion of precession. Not procession, precession, which is Earth's wobble. And they always liken an example of a child's top. I don't know if you still get children's tops that you swish around, but I'm sure we remember them. Yeah, they do this. So like a spinning top, the axis of rotation gradually traces out this conical shape as they show it on the diagram here. There's the diagram. And it means that it's a slow process, but it's cumulative, takes about 26,000 years. Yeah, mental. And what happens is the Earth's tilt remains the same at 23.5 degrees, but the orientation of that tilt is rotating round. Does this make sense? It's quite difficult looking at this three-dimensional thing in 2 dimensions. Making sense? Yes. Thank you. So it means that, remember, the stars out there effectively are static for us. So, but if the Earth is tilting over time, what we see is going to change over time. The stars will appear to be moving. Yeah. So at the moment, the North Star is Polaris, but that's only by coincidence. Several thousand years ago, Vega was the pole star, 13,000 years ago, halfway through the current cycle. So the direction of the axis changes, and then it appears that all the stars are changing. So if we look at this in this context, if we assume that the stars are fixed on this celestial sphere around us, the Southern Cross is sitting around about here. So when the Earth is tilted as it is now, it's visible to the southern half of the world, yeah? And we're pointing at Polaris. Years ago, okay, and can you see how the Southern Cross, which is still here, would have been visible from further north? Yeah, so that's why the Greeks and others were actually able to observe what the Southern Cross stars that far north. So it's an ongoing, slow process. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you. This process of precession is also called the precession of the equinoxes, because if you take a mental stretch of the equator out to the edge of the celestial sphere, as the tilt changes, the tilt of this blue area is going to change. And the point at which that celestial equator is ecliptic, which is the route that the sun takes across the sky, is going to change. So this point actually slowly moves westwards, about 1 degree every 72 years. So as the Earth is tilt changing, the equinox, or where the ecliptic crosses, is also moving. Yep. The net effect of all this is that star maps need to be changed over time. As I say, Hipparchus picked up the differences because he was looking over a large time gap. So I don't think the people who produce the star maps or the Sky Guide have to do this every year, but obviously over extended time periods, the stars' locations will become more and more inaccurate, and you need to update catalogs. Computers will do all that now. And I'm sure AI will do it next without any hassles. But obviously, when all this was done manually in the past, it's all had to be, particularly for navigation purposes, you might find that every 100 years or so that they have to change the star maps. Okay, let's look a bit at the history of the Southern Cross and Crooks, because as I've already intimated, they're totally entwined. Now, in ancient Greece, again, we're going back to 150 CE, Hipparchus' time. The stars that are now the Southern Cross and Crooks were just part of Centaurus. There were 48 Greek constellations, a lot of them linked with mythology. So this is why we have Orion and Jupiter and And Centaurus was just 5, the stars of Crooks were just part of Centaurus, this mythical animal human beast. And these constellations were identified by the Greek astronomer Ptolemy, who was actually based in Alexandria at the time, because it was during the occupation of Egypt. And he developed this famous book called the Almagest. And he used Hipparchus's observations and produced these constellations and did wonderful drawings. In the early beginning of the Christian era, so around about the same time, people noticed this cross shape in the sky because Christianity now existed, and the symbol of Christianity is the cross. So people started seeing this cross. Before it had just been stars as part of Centaurus. And this has been the history of a lot of these structures, is that cultural, how we see things up there, links to our life experience, our culture. So in the early Christianity, you can imagine the days of early Christianity, this cross was visible and was seen as symbolic. And over time, as I've already said, the Southern Cross became less and less visible. And early on, and it was seen as a sort of sign of the crucifixion by early Christians. So as the Southern Cross, or this cross in the sky, disappeared over the years, it was the sign of Christ's death and dying. And as I say, it was linked. And then by about 400 CE, what is now Crooks, the Crook stars, are no longer visible from Europe, and people forgot about it for about 1,000 years. Until, I'll just do a little bit on Centaurus. So it's this large constellation, the 9th biggest, half man, half beast. As I said, it previously included what is now Crooks. And physically, it's around, if you recognize this as Crooks, this asterism here, if we go out and look at Crooks, it's surrounded on 3 sides by Centaurus. In fact, the 2 pointers that we use to find the Southern Cross are the front legs of the centaur. Okay, so history. So if we've moved forward about 1,000 years, age of discovery. Who were the first people who started traveling around the world? Came to Africa first, didn't settle. The Portuguese. Yes. Yeah, no, we got Egyptians as well, but there's no history about that. History only exists when you can write it down. So this is a lot of the early sightings were by Portuguese explorers or people on Portuguese exploring ships, because they were beginning to travel the world. There is a suggestion that Dante actually was aware of this 4-star asterism, because apparently he mentioned it in the Divine Comedy in 1329. By the 1400s, explorers, again, remember Christian background, very strong Christian things, the Portuguese, strong Catholic traditions, began to notice this again. What had been lost, if you like, in Europe, it was now being noticed by these travelers as they moved south. And they saw this distinctive cross shape, and then they would report back. But these people they used navigation, but this is all new stuff down the southern areas. They were familiar with the north navigating. Suddenly they were traveling south, and it was all very new. So it was very sporadic sort of identification. The first record that seems to be of the Southern Cross as such seems to go back to 1455, when this Venetian Alvisa Cadmusta, but he was traveling on a Portuguese voyage, was apparently traveling, leaving the Gambia River up on the west coast of Africa, and he named what is believed to be the first known depiction of the Southern Cross, and he called it the Southern Chariot. So that's it's beginning to come into people's awareness. 50 years later, João Fares, who was again on a Portuguese exploration voyage, is credited as the first European to depict the Southern Cross correctly. And the upper one is his original drawing, or and then the bottom one is an interpretation, because it took a while for me to work out what they were saying here. What they've suggested is the Southern Cross are these 5 stars. And even then you can see this one is in the wrong place. It should be further over. Interestingly, with only one pointer. He might have picked up both pointers. But this is what historians accept is the first recorded and it's an accurate depiction. And he sent this in a letter back to his, I suppose his funder, the King of Portugal, the person who was actually paying for his journey. And he named the feature the guards. I don't know who the guards were, what they were guarding, but that's what he's got here as Lag Guardas, I think it is. Yeah. Then Farras's observation was independently confirmed a little later, a couple of years later, by this Amerigo Vespucci, who was also on a Portuguese voyage. And he also identified what we now know as the pointers. He identified the Coalsack Nebula. And this is while he was traveling to the Far East around Africa. In 1516, the Italian navigator, Andrea Casali, again while traveling, but he was on a Portuguese voyage, wrote to his Medici patrons. So you see how the information is beginning to spread across Europe or into bits of Europe. And he described the Southern Cross, what we now know as the Southern Cross, as so fair and beautiful that no other heavenly sign may be compared with it. Obviously, he was impressed. And he actually included a map. And it's the possibility that he was the first European to actually name the shape a cross. Obviously, people might well have verbally perceived it, but apparently this is the first written record. And I have his book, this thing he wrote has been translated, copied over time. So there are various versions of it, but the area is the Southern Cross. And these few thingies here of the Magellanic Clouds. I haven't been able to find out what the A means. It wasn't relevant, so I moved on. But I was intrigued. I thought, what is A? Haven't been able to find out. I have no idea, because this is the original. Somebody's obviously added some, there's interpretation when they translate and or copy. And in fact, you can even see the position of the stars is slightly different here. So these have been manually copied. Now, by the 1590s, so we're getting to the end of the 16th century, what we call I can never say this, uranographers. Nothing to do with your health. These are people who map the stars. So the first mapping of stars was beginning to happen. Obviously, people were fairly familiar with the Northern Hemisphere. But there was these people like Emery Molyneux, Petrus Plancius, were either producing globes or the first wall maps of stars, but they relied on information from sources. They weren't directly observing these. So there were a lot of inaccuracies and big gaps physically between what the explorers were seeing and what was being recorded. And that's what they both located it on theirs, but inaccurately. Then in 1594, Robert Hughes, who was familiar with Ptolemy's Almagest, so he knew what the Centaurus looked like. He is probably the first person to actually recognize the Southern Cross in the Almagest, in Centaurus, in terms of it's those stars that make up the Southern Cross. So again, quite close in time. And then he did some observing. There are no other than the brightest stars which are in the Centaur's feet. So again, he's showing that he's using his knowledge from an accurate source. Plancius and this Hondius first to actually show what is now the crux in its correct position on their globes. So you can see the accuracy of mapping is improving over time. As this process continues, a few years later, the German astronomer Johann Bayer produced the first full star map of the skies, the entire skies, in what this publication called Uranometria. Now, he drew the Southern Cross in, but he put it on the legs. He clearly wasn't too sure. And you can see it sitting here in the wrong place, here on the lower drawing. So, the first to allocate the Greek name, the Greek letters to stars, he began to sort of apply knowledge on magnitude and brightness. So you get the alphas and the betas, etc. But the Southern Cross is still part of Centaurus. And in fact, he gave the four brightest stars Greek letters, which were part of Centaurus's Greek letters. Yeah. So the brightest was epsilon, which is the others. So Southern Cross recognized, but still part of Centaurus. Then in 1603, in the same year, the Dutch explorer Frederick de Houtman was the first to actually catalogue what are now the Crookes stars separately from Centaurus. But it's still not Crookes. In 1624, so that's about 20 years later, Jacob Bosch was the first to adopt the constellation Crookes. I couldn't find out who actually named it. I haven't been able to find out who actually said, we're going to call this Crookes. I've done an internet search as far as I can, and I haven't been able to find it sort of given to a particular person. This guy did it, but apparently it was Augustin Royer in 1679, some years later, who's actually credited with identifying Crookes as a separate constellation. Big gap in time. Probably a bit of politics in there as well. And in 1687, another German astronomer, Hevelius, located Crookes correctly. He was the first to actually put Crookes in the right place. And then the reference, because Louis de Lacaille worked here in the 1750s, he actually was the first person who actually allocated Greek letters to the Southern Cross stars in their own right. They became alpha, beta, gamma, delta, etc. So it took years before this sort of really became everything. Crookes, Latin word for cross, only formally included in the modern list of 88 constellations, 1928, less than 100 years ago. Seems to take on a while to sort of get themselves organized. Official boundary set in 1930, and as I said, it's surrounded by Centaurus on three sides, and then we've got Musca, the fly, to the south. It's the smallest of the modern constellations, and although we only ever think about the Southern Cross, it actually contains other structures. Cepheid variables, the jewel box, which I'm sure we're familiar with, the Coalsack Nebula, contains no Messier objects, so nothing that was notable to Messier. Southern Cross per se, as we've already made clear, the brightest stars form this distinct cross shape. And interestingly, the five brightest stars visible to the naked eye, so it isn't always the case. The three blue, we've got these very bright white blue ones, and then two red ones. And the three bright blue ones actually all have originated in the same molecular cloud within a very close time period. So they're actually siblings. Basically, I can't remember where is what. If you start at the bottom, on the end of the long south-facing, the long axis, the south side, the spiral, and that's A, B, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon. So you can always work out where they are, which is what. It's very useful. The bright stars are what are called familial stars, and they're members of this so-called SCO-CEN association, or Scorpio-Centaurus association. They're part of the nearest group of stars. The sort of OBs are the very young, very energetic, very hot, very bright stars. We said that, you remember, they were blue. The OB groups are type stars. Now, the closest of that group, the Sun, contains several star-forming formations, a lot of molecular clouds where stars are forming, one of which is the Coalsack Nebula. There are three subgroups, and the one we're interested in is the one on here, the subgroup. They're a member of this big star family, so loosely. All under 20 million years old, which for stars is not old. And they, again, have the same proper motion. They're moving apart and across the skies at the same speed. And they're all within a very similar age range. So they're like a bunch of siblings. They're gradually moving apart as they grow up or get older. And over time, these associations, obviously the stars are moving apart. They will disperse, but I don't think we need to worry. 30 million years, we'll be long gone by then. So if we look at Crux's brightest stars, or this in the more specifically, A Crux, which as I said is the southerly one of the long axis, the brightest. If we look at it, it looks like one star. In fact, over time, it's realized it's actually got at least 6 stars that make it up. Its name, A Crux, obviously just comes from Alpha Crucis. 13th brightest star in the sky, slightly variable, so sometimes the 12th, but it's one of the brightest. It's a multiple star system. I won't give you the measurements here, but it's hot, energetic, and very bright and young. And fairly close to us, 322 light years from Earth is fairly close. I have a Cape connection here because Crux was first seen as more than one star, as a double star in the Cape. In 1685, which is not that long after Van Riebeck arrived, the Jesuit priest, Father Jean de Fontenay, was actually traveling to the Far East with another group, with a group of priests. And they stopped at Cape Town. And he actually stayed at what was then the new Cape of Good Hope Castle, because the original castle was just it was basically wattle and daub, but it was just clay and wood. And the Dutch got very nervous and said, no, we need something a little more robust because, you know, people are breathing down our necks and they might attack us. So they built the first stone castle, which was able to find sketches in 80. So he would have looked like that. And then obviously over time, it's got more and more complicated and they've added buildings and things until we have today. So he was a keen astronomer, the father, and he did a little light show in the castle. No light pollution in those days. And when he was looking through a telescope, he noticed that A Crux actually was at least 2 stars. So that was first spotted in Cape Town. A Crux, also known as Mimosa, is named, the Mimosa name comes from the name for its brightest star. It's also a multi-star system. A little fainter than A Crux, 20th brightest. Again, also same family, so hot, young, massive, multiple star system. It's got here thought to be the hottest magnitude, 1 star. And again, it's quite close to Earth, 279 light years. So we're looking here. Yeah, bright red. Crux, I'm assuming it's pronounced. And if you look in the northern hemisphere, well, further north you go, this is the one you'll see. The Southern Cross disappears because it's the most northerly. It's really close to Earth. It's only 89 light years away. It's the closest Southern Cross star to Earth, and also the closest red giant. It's a binary system, so it has at least 2 stars. This very large red giant, elderly, and it's obviously another in the binary, small one. Variable star, its magnitude, its brightness changes slowly. And I won't worry about the details. Gamma, known as I think MI or MI or Gamma Crux. This is named. I quite find it strange that this little obscure tribe was given a name to a star, but it has. It's named from the Mercy people, MUSI people in Ethiopia, who track it and use it to tell them about flood levels in their river. And apparently the MI is the grass that is flattened when the river is at a certain height. And it's become the name for a star, which I think is great. I love it when you get some sort of really sort of, if you like the word ethnic name being given to something, recognition. It's the most distant, but it's still fairly close to 345 years. It seems to be it's a Cepheid variable, so it's a variable star. Its brightness varies on a regular basis. And then the last one we'll look at is Epsilon, which is known as Jinan. And this is named, the name comes from an Aboriginal tribe in the Northern Territory in Australia, who use the word Jinan to mean a dilly bag or a bag of song. Again, it's good. I like that. It's very old, 2 billion years, also an orange giant, but it's slightly further, more distant and also smaller than Guy Crux is, hence its smaller magnitude. So those are the 5 main stars. So if we go to navigate, we have a problem in the Southern Hemisphere. We've got Polaris sitting up there saying the North Pole is right here. So very useful for navigation. And these explorers, as soon as they moved further south, the Polaris got further and further away and lower until it disappeared. But there's no equivalent in the southern hemisphere. And apparently this is known as the South Polar Pit. But we can try and find it. So if you take the most accurate is to take a line on the long axis, extend it down, take a perpendicular line from the middle of the 2 pointers, and where they cross, down. We find you're pretty close to our South Pole. Other people say you just take 4.5 times the length of this axis. How do you do that? I think you need to use both. You need to triangulate a bit or triangulate. It's obviously not absolutely accurate. It's not within 1 degree like Laura's is at the moment. It's probably close enough for navigational purposes. Most people aren't heading that far south anyway. So if anyone says, where does your house point? You can say, let me just find where south is. Right, so the Southern Cross in mythology and folklore. The Incas in the 15th century are a possible group of people who actually were familiar with the Southern Cross as a shape. Because up at Machu Picchu, apparently, they have found this cat-shaped stone. It's obviously been carved. And the angle of the long line runs north-south. So it's proposed or suggested that this is actually that they use the Southern Cross, some means of symbolism and direction. Speculation because there are no records. The Inca name for the structure means stair, and I think it may link to the fact that the Incas apparently believed in 3 levels. You had the underworld, the living world, and the heavens, and that maybe this was some direction between somewhere, hopefully going up to the heavens. In Argentina, it's a rhea, which is an ostrich. The rhea is a type of South American ostrich, or like an emu. So can you see how people's culture and their knowledge areas tend to be then attached to what they see up in the heavens? The Aboriginals have a long history of the Southern Cross. They, interestingly, a lot of their tribes don't see the stars. They see the black areas. They see the hollows. And they see this emu, the emu in the sky. And it sort of works around all the dark areas. They're quite, as I said, there are quite a lot of molecular clouds in the areas of dark patches. And they see this emu. Korea did, South America did. So the emu is formed from the dark spaces. It's very interesting, just from a human perspective, anthropologically, to think that there are people who actually see the same thing in a completely different way. We see the points and the angles and the edges. They look at what's inside. Other interpretations, often including the pointers, are again 2 brothers who killed the emu with a spear, a possum, an eagle, a group of parrots, a stingray. I like this one. 5, the Southern Cross, 5 naughty youngsters scattered with a spear. The pointer was thrown at them. Or it's the 5 plus the 5 stars plus the 2 pointers, or the people who made the laws, went up to the heavens and they watched to ensure that they're being obeyed. New Zealand, not surprising. Apparently 8 names in Maori. And again, they see a variety of different perceptions. One group sees this as the anchor. Yeah, I've managed to find a picture. So we've got Southern Cross here anchoring the Milky Way. So they're looking at it in a broader context. Sometimes it's seen as an opening of the sky through which storm winds escape. In Tonga, these are the Pacific Islands. I like this, a duck flying south with a wounded wing after characters threw a stone at it. In Samoa, it's seen as a triggerfish. And you can see the resemblance here. If we look at the fish, it's got a diamond shape. And then other islands like the Solomons, the Marshalls, again, have labeled the Southern Cross relating to their mythology, to the lifestyle, particularly fishing, which makes sense because that's how they live. In Africa, I found out that the Tuareg who live up in the way up north, in Morocco and places, they see it as one of their desert trees, which I managed to find on the internet. Most of what we've got is from Southern Africa. So several groups see the Southern Cross and the pointers as a herd of giraffe, which is what we've got here, as lions. I tend to see animals, which is rather interesting. I like the Sutu law. When the giraffe is seen close to the southwest, it's time to cultivate. So again, it's influence of the positions of stars on life. The Kur, the San, see the pointers as signs of lions. And again, depending on which groups and which sources, we've got different genders and different groups doing different things, but essentially it's a group of lions. And then in the San law, the 2 pointers are male lions, which were once men turned into stars by a magical girl. It's a lovely story. Right, as a cultural symbol, pretty familiar with most of these. So some countries have the Southern Cross on their flags. So the 5 best known ones are Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Samoa, and Papua New Guinea. They all have the Southern Cross. Interestingly, if you look at the Brazilian one, the Southern Cross is, in fact, all the stars are the wrong way around. Because the person who designed it didn't do it from Earth looking up. He positioned himself outside the stars, looking in. So from outside, the Southern Cross is actually this way around instead of this way around. Yeah. Which in some of the early star map people, uranographers, actually also did the same thing. They tended to look at the stars from the outside rather than from us humans looking out. We can find also the Southern Cross used in sort of more locally on state, regional, provincial flags, coats of arms naturally in Southern Hemisphere countries. We use the Southern Cross at the Hermanus Astronomy Center. Those of you who get the newsletter, who are members, will recognize this. Those who aren't members, if you join, you'll get a newsletter. It's actually called the Southern Cross newsletter. We've adopted it as well. And it's used in logos, sports teams, stamps, coins. The list is actually very long. It's used in some songs, national anthems, Australia, Brazil, Samoa, poetry. It's been used to name planes, ships, towns. In fact, there's a town in Australia called Southern Cross. I think there's a university, Southern Cross University as well. Newspapers, companies, and others. So it's fairly embedded in our, not just in indigenous cultures, but in European, in sort of white cultures as well. In South Africa, I was interested to find this. There was this thing called the Order of the Southern Cross, which was introduced in 1986, discontinued in 2002. So these are 2 images of them, which has only actually been awarded to 5 people. And it's for those who have citizens who have displayed singular and exceptional achievement for our nation. So this was brought in before the change of government. So that obviously goes both. So the recipients, Chris Barnard, Philip Tobias, who was a famous paleontologist, Nadine Gordimer, the author, Eski I can't say this man's name, and Mphahlele, who I understand was also an author. He wrote poetry and, he was a writer in a broad sense. And then to the liberation people, Oliver Tambo and Albert Luthuli. So it has also been used in this country. Now, the last bit we're looking at here, I tried to find literary mentions of the Southern Cross, and I realized that people either didn't come down here or they just didn't know about it because it wasn't in their world thing. The old story, if you wanted to look up things about northern stars, I'm sure Wordsworth and all these people and Shakespeare referred to it. This is all I could find. Mark Twain. And I couldn't find out when he did this or what, but I'm assuming he saw it. It's very convoluted. We saw the cross tonight, and it is not large. It is ingeniously named, for it looks just as a cross would look if it looked like something else. One must ignore the little star and leave it out of the combination. How much beer had this man been drinking? It confuses everything. If you leave it out, you can make out the 4 stars a sort of cross. Joy Packer, who I'm sure we are familiar with, she talked about the diamond-studded kite. And the only other ones I could find that it actually was satirical people in New Zealand. I don't know what the link is. But there was a British satirical writer called Samuel Butler, and he spent some time in New Zealand. The Southern Cross is a very great delusion. It is a kite upside down, with only 3 respectable stars and one very poor and very much out of place. But he was a satirist. And then some unknown diarist in New Zealand said the Southern Cross is a fraud, in as much as it's scarcely brighter than its neighbors. And I couldn't find any other literary mentions. I think somebody needs to address this. You know, we've got the Southern Cross is the one thing that a lot of people know about the Southern Hemisphere stars, and we've got nothing in the literature. So I really think we need to address this, because I'm sure if it was seen visible in the Northern Hemisphere, there'd be copious references. We already know that because of precession, the position of the Southern Cross that we see is changing. So what's going to happen in the future? So the crooks will continue to move ever closer to the South Pole and then move northwards. We've already explained that. In a few thousand years, the South Celestial Pole will have moved so much that crooks will no longer be useful as a navigation aid. AI will probably have sorted that out by then. In about 14,000 years, crooks will again be visible from many parts of Europe, Asia, and North America. So it will sort of go back to where it was when the Greeks could see it. And then 18,000 years, it will have become even visible further north. And then my last question, which I couldn't find an answer to, is how far south will crooks be visible in 18,000 years? I reckon we'll still see it, but it won't be, it obviously is going to be positioned further north. Because if at the moment we can see it's 34 and it's still visible at 34 north, you know, if you look at the other way, I don't think we're going to lose the view of the Southern Cross. It's just not going to be as useful. Well, I can tell you, you can let us know. You know, it's the sort of thing you can easily run up on a supercomputer. I couldn't find the answer. Yeah, it probably is. I did a literature search I put in, you know, and I got no answers, but there probably is information. So there you are. I hope you found that interesting. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Aboriginals and the Southern Cross have very, very close cultural ties, and I love their art. I love all the little dots and things. I found some paintings. And in fact, some of these came with explanations by the painters on why the cross was there in their drawing or in their piece and what it meant to them. So it's really embedded in their lives. I'm happy to try and answer any questions if anyone has any or any comments.
The question might be
get the pun. Sorry.
The last two shots, why are they at 4 essentially?
Which do the pointers?
Yes.
All right, the question is why are the pointers associated with the Southern Cross? My understanding is that if you look up at the clear night sky, you see actually 3 cross shapes. And sort of there's the false cross, and then in fact between the two there's a diamond-shaped cross. And I think that because the pointers are there, they physically say that one is the Southern Cross. I think it's pure expedience that the two happen, that their direction and the position of the Southern Cross coincide. And the fact that the false cross, which is the one nearest to Canopus, is called the false cross, suggests that having pointers is really helpful. And as I say, between the two, there is a diamond-shaped, much paler diamond-shaped cross.
That's why they call it pointers.
Because they're pointing at the Southern Cross, yeah. Any other thoughts, quick comments?
Now, we used to use Southern Cross at night time in the army, fighting in Mozambique. We used to operate at night time against Brazil, and Southern Cross was critical to our operation. But it didn't used to use poles, because poles were quite enough. One thing. The second thing is that I had a push-in tracker in the army with me, attached to me, and he measured the kite, and he was the one that showed me that the cross position around about, say, 7 o'clock at night time varied in the year. So, at different times of the year, it would be that side, or that. And his understanding of the cross was that 2 lions, pointers, following 4 adult giraffes, one of them a female, maybe, 3 females and 1 male, and then the small one, the epsilon, I think it is the actual calf. giraffe.
Oh, there you go. That's lovely. I mean, a real example. So giraffes and and lions all in one thing. Derek, you'd have heard that? Yeah, but it's basically that they used Southern Cross was used in navigation by the South African Air Force, and yes, and then we have evidence from an actual San person that this perception is true. Get it?
But then when we go camping, we used to use the Southern Cross to determine time, because on a watch it takes 12 hours to go around, but it takes 24 hours for it to move. Therefore, it moves from say position 12 to 1 in 2 hours. So you just have to make that adjustment.
Clearly it works, but it sounds quite complicated. But yeah, it's really useful to be able to use it.
I think it's interesting you asked earlier on any other inferences to the Southern Cross. You didn't mention the Chinese.
I didn't mention the Chinese because I found it very difficult that there was mention of the Chinese, but it was very vague.
Well, if you read a book called 1421 by Gavin,
Yeah.
it changes the whole concept.
Yeah, he has a different thing. Yeah, what I picked up was the Chinese one was mention of a guardhouse, and it was very vague. And I thought I couldn't get this into something focused. Yeah, there are people who've interpreted, but yes, the Chinese did actually also observe. And remember, they were very important astronomers.
They sailed, right?
Yeah. So I did find mention, but as I said, I couldn't find anything tangible that I could sort of put together in a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm rambling on. And I'm sure there were others as well. The Indians probably were observers as well, but there was no mention of that. But I'm not saying what they didn't do it. I just didn't find information on that. Any other?
I suggest that you bring in the musical reference as well. Something called Nash and Young. Seems about the Southern Cross is very, very,
Oh, there you go. That's right. So I mentioned that it was mentioned in songs and lyrics, didn't I? But it's nice having an example. Any other thoughts, comments?
Refers to true north in sort of the direction the east heads. As the southern hemisphere grows, so you believe that that your true north really is southern right. So if you make that, the upside down sort of like the upside down tree,
But if you're actually using it to navigate, you've got to be able to see it. And if you can't see it because you're over the curve, then you can't, can you? This is what navigators struggled with, and they had no southern reference point. And remember also, the Southern Ocean is vast. They couldn't use land as guiding points and things like you could to some greater extent in the Northern Hemisphere. So they had a lot of problems with navigation and going the wrong way.
With the navigator, the first cross that came up was the false cross. So you didn't get pointers to indicate you followed the false cross, you're still taking somewhere around the
Yeah. I mean, clearly you need to have some idea of the astronomy and how things are arranged so that you can actually make those calculations. But it's much more complex and up north where you can actually just use the pole star. Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
So the sun point is halfway between the point, not the brightest star, and Asana, halfway there.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Asana is the only other star that gives you some direction. So
Oh, that's news. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. That's Eridanus. Okay, thank you. I think thank you very much. I hope you've had an enjoyable time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vinny. I definitely learned a lot. There was, I think, 9/10 of what you said was new to me. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Looked up to you.
Thank you. And please thank you, Derek, for all the technical stuff. Wouldn't have happened without him. Wouldn't have happened without him.